Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be looking at a Temur Turbo Fog deck. So this is kind of an inspiration from the Make Magic Great Again deck, which was a bit turbo foggy with walls. I did try it as a Bant version with the walls, but it turned out that playing walls was just a little bit pointless, most of all, because your opponent just built up a board and then the moment they got over the walls, it was a bit like you just ended up having to blow your own wall up, essentially. So just for everyone to know, building walls ain't good. So what is Turbo Fog? Turbo Fog is essentially a mill deck for the most part, and it allows you to use things like fog to prevent combat damage, so you can literally stall out the game for as long as you need to pull out the victory. So, we'll start right at the beginning. Fog, 1 green mana, instant speed, prevent all combat damage that will be dealt this turn. So, you literally every single turn, once you're down to a low enough life to need to do it anyway, you pay the 1 mana, you prevent all combat damage, and essentially your opponent has swung in for everything that they have, and you just negate it altogether, which buys you an extra turn, which is an extra trigger on Sphinx's Tutelage, which gets you that little bit closer to victory. So we're attempting to fog our opponent every single turn where it's relevant, essentially, and keep getting these fogs back. So, next card is Thing in the Ice. This is pretty good with Turbo Fog. 1 and a blue, 0/4 Defender. Thing in the Ice enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, remove an ice counter from Thing in the Ice. Then, if it has no ice counters on it, transform it. So essentially, what we're planning on doing is putting one of these guys down, and if we fog and draw cards 4 times in a row, we flip Thing in the Ice into a Awoken Horror, which essentially turns our wall into a 7/8 mass bounce spell. So whenever this creature transforms into a Awoken Horror, return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. So your opponent, when you're turbo fogging, generally just overextends. That's usually what happens. They put out more than they need to try kill you. So it forces those fogs out. But what that does for us is allow us to get Thing in the Ice down and make our opponent really pay for overextending. So they'll spend about 5 turns building up this insane board, and in just 4 instant spells we can bounce their entire board back, force them to discard to hand size, that kind of thing, and they've got no further into the game. So Thing in the Ice goes really well in a Turbo Fog deck for that reason. We then have Commencement of Festivities. This is one of the reasons why Turbo Fog has become a little bit more powerful through Kaladesh. 1 and green, instant speed, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to players this turn. So initially I wanted to try a Turbo Fog deck that was more Super Friends based, because essentially Fog allows to prevents all combat damage. But Commencement of Festivities, I misread it and assumed it did the same thing. However, it only prevents damage dealt to players and combat damage more specifically, so burn spells can get around it. And also your opponent's attacking your planeswalkers, this does not stop them. So turned out a Super Friends version of Turbo Fog was a little bit more difficult than it needed to be, so yeah. We've got Reclamation Sages, so if we're in a mirror match for example, or we have vehicles, we have a 2 and a green 2/1 creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. So artifacts may include Dynavolt Towers to burn you out, or vehicles like Smuggler's Copters and things like that, and your Sky Sovereigns. Enchantments might be Sphinx's Tutelage is the most predominant one. Maybe even a Fevered Visions can be a bit difficult for us because we kind of want to hold on to all of our fogs for as long as possible. So that would end up burning us out, and we don't want that because we can't fog away any burn. So Reclamation Sages deal very well with that. We do have ways of getting them back as well when they die, so we do have 2, but we kind of have more ways to have more than 2, if that makes any sense. We then have Imprisoned in the Moon, so for 2 and a blue enchantment aura, enchant creature, land, or planeswalker, and that permanent is a colourless land with add colourless to your mana pool, and loses all other card types and abilities. So this is our planeswalker removal. This is also removal for things like your Ulamogs and stuff that we can't fog out the way. So certain things that when they attack rather than deal combat damage do something horrible, we have Imprisoned in the Moon to make sure that they don't do that anymore. So Ulamog, for example, only needs to attack in order to exile 20 cards. So Imprisoned in the Moon stops them from attacking altogether. So we can get around our weakness, which is just preventing combat damage and not the attack itself. Also, of course, it is Planeswalker removal, so we can allow our opponent to keep their Planeswalkers for as long as they want. And if they're close to ultimating or something like that, we're just imprisoning the moon them, and they suddenly stop being even slightly relevant to us. So that's mainly what we want to do. And lands, perhaps, if they've got some sort of looting land and they're playing mill, then we might want to do something with that as well. We then have the key win card of the deck, Sphinx's Tutelage. So for 2 and a blue enchantment, whenever you draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his graveyard. If they're both non-land cards and share a colour, repeat this process. So every single time we draw a card, our opponent mills 2. If those cards have the same colour and they're not lands, then we mill another 2, essentially. So it punishes your opponent for being less colours. So your mono red aggro decks are really good against this, so we can mill aggro decks a lot faster than we can, say, control decks like Esper and stuff like that. And aggro decks as well, with our fogs, can really be slowed down that way. They do mean that we have to fog a lot earlier, but Sphinx's Tutelage works a lot faster with less colours, and less colours usually means more aggressive decks, for the most part anyway. So that is our win card. It also has the ability to draw a card and discard a card for 6 mana as well, which might just be all we need to close out the final bit of the game. If we've got multiple Tutelages on the battlefield, for example, we can just pay 6 to mill up to 6 cards out of our opponent's library. So it's really good for that. We then have Fevered Vision. So this card usually is not too far away from Sphinx's Tutelage when you think mill. So for 1 and a blue and a red enchantment, at the beginning of each player's end step, that player draws a card. If the player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Vision deals 2 damage to him or her. So this punishes control decks, essentially. If we can get this down, we can punish our opponent for having too many cards in hand. Also, it benefits us because we also get to draw a card, which is an extra trigger on the Tutelage. But if we don't have Tutelage, it's an extra draw towards our mill decks, our card draw spells, and gets us closer to finding the Tutelage. So it's really a win-win situation for us. You don't want to do this against an aggressive deck, though. A deck that can empty its hand out really quickly, you're not going to really benefit from Fevered Visions as much as you'd like. So your red deck wins, for example, that empty their hand on turn 3, you really don't want to be giving them extra cards to get that extra little bit of damage. So it's really one of those things that you got to evaluate your current board state, your current situation, see whether you want to play it or not, see whether the benefit of the extra draw for you is worth them drawing an extra card, especially if they're not getting burnt for it. We then have Hydra Lash, so for 2 and a blue instant speed, attacking creatures get -2, -0 until the end of the turn. So this is our weakest fog spell, but depending on what your opponent's playing, it could be a complete fog. So essentially it takes the 2 attack off of your opponent's creatures. If they're playing Thopters, for example, that will just completely negate all the Thopter damage. If they're playing bigger stuff, then it's not going to do as much, but the upside is, at the very least, you get to draw a card off of it. So even if your opponent's not attacking, and your opponent's not running creatures, this is not a dead card in your hand, because it is a 3 mana cycle spell, which is good for Tutelages, and it's good for getting better cards into your hand if this is not a suitable card for you. We then have Kozilek's Return. So for 2 and a red, mythic instant, Devoid. Kozilek's Return deals 2 damage to each creature. So this is really good for your Thopter decks and your Servo decks, things like that. One way you really need to wipe the board of small creatures, maybe in the early game as well, red deck wins for example. You might want to get rid of all their tokens and stuff like that. And also, this is relevant to the deck. Whenever you cast an Eldrazi creature spell with converted mana cost 7 or greater, you may exile Kozilek's Return from your graveyard, and if you do, it deals 5 damage to each creature. So if this guy's in our graveyard, and we, for example, go all the way to our end, we have Vexing Scutters, which is an Eldrazi crab, of 8 mana. If we end up casting one of them, then we can actually exile Kozilek's Return and wipe the board completely clear. For the most part, you will wipe their entire board clear. Short of things like Ulamogs and other emerged creatures, most creatures have 5 toughness or less, so you will wipe the board this way, which is really great, and they don't tend to see it coming as well, since it is in your graveyard, and it's only a matter of you just finding one of the 2 vexing scholars that you've got. And it's also a May ability, so you don't have to do it, because it might wipe your own board if you've got, for example, a Thing in the Ice. We do run a low creature count, so it's not very likely that the board state on your side, creature-wise, is something that you'll feel sad about losing, just because the deck really doesn't rely on creatures that much, but it's there. Then we have Radiant Flames. This is the slightly more powerful version of the dumbed-down edition of Kozilek's Return. So for 2 and a red, Converge, Radiant Flames deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of colours spent to cast Radiant Flames. So this, in our deck, will be a 3 damage board wipe across the board. Yet again, really good for getting rid of servos, thopters, and other low toughness creatures. Aggro decks, like your red-white vehicles and stuff like that, all have toughness 3 or less for the most part. So Radiant Flames is really good for that. It's just an extra board wipe to slow our opponent down. If they do overextend, we'll wipe their board, and then we don't have to fog then. We can just build up fogs for as long as we want, so that when they finally do get their board state back, we can just continue fogging again, or maybe wipe their board again. So it's really good for that kind of thing. Collective Defiance, so for 1 and 2 red, sorcery speed with Escalate. I'll get back to that in a second. So you can choose 1 or more of these options. So we can either choose to discard all the cards in our hand and draw that many cards. Note that I read that differently to what it says, because you never really want to make your opponent discard all the cards in their hand. Unless you've seen them Diabolic Tutor for something and they haven't cast it, you really want to be pointing this at yourself so that you can redraw your entire hand for the most part. If you've got tutelages on the board, this can trigger for like up to 6 triggers on a tutelage, which is 12 cards, which is a fair stack of your opponent's deck at that point. We then have Collective Defiance. Collective Defiance deals 4 damage to target creature. So this gets rid of Kalatas, it gets rid of spell quellers that might have stolen your card draw spells or your mill spells, things like that. It kills most creatures in the format, so it's really good. And Collective Defiance deals 3 damage to target opponent. So if we have gone slightly down the burn route with our Fevered Visions, or we've been attacking him with our Manlands, things like that, then the 3 damage can come in really useful for that. It's also good that we can point that at our opponent's Planeswalkers as well, which is more than likely going to be the target rather than our opponent, because we are a mill deck. We are trying to not burn our opponent out, we're trying to get their deck into their graveyard, so the 3 damage here is less relevant, but if they have a Planeswalker down, it can stop them from ultimating for quite some time. So, come back to the Escalate. If we want to do 1 or more of these options, so for 1 option we pay the 1 and 2 red. If we want to pay an extra, we just have to pay an extra 1 mana. So we can essentially call this a 3 and 2 red to do all of these things, which is not bad. 5 mana to mill your opponent for 12, burn a creature, and burn one of your opponent's Planeswalkers is pretty brutal. We then have Glimmer of Genius, so for 3 and a blue, instant speed, scry 2, draw 2, and get 2 energy. So this allows us to set up our draws to suit our board state. So maybe we find out that our fogs are quite dead in our matchup. If it's a controlling deck that doesn't actually use creatures, then our fogs are quite useless. So we want to make sure that when we scry, that we get the right cards for the situation on top of our deck, because we do not want to draw into any kind of fog cards when our opponent has no creatures, because it's just completely pointless. We then get to draw 2 cards, so if we scribe them to the bottom, we've gone 4 cards deep in a nutshell. And then we get 2 energy. The 2 energy is quite relevant because we do use ether hubs, so that extra 2 energy is putting the colour back into our ether hubs in a nutshell, which is usually enough for the ether hubs to stay online constantly for the rest of the game. So we've got 3 copies of that. We then have Comparative Analysis. So it's kind of the same thing. For 3 and a blue, target player draws 2 cards. However, if you cast a spell before this, or a teammate, not so relevant in this case because we're going 1-on-1, then you actually get to cast it for 3 at instant speed. So if your opponent is attacking you and you had the choice between Glimmer of Genius and Comparative Analysis, you may want to use a fog first, which prevents all combat damage, and then pay the 2 and a blue to draw 2 cards, which essentially, for the same amount of mana as the Glimmer of Genius, has prevented all combat damage and draws the same amount of cards. So it's really useful for that kind of thing. We only got 2 of them though, so it won't be as often that is the case, but that's the main use for it. It's also just extra card draw. Gets us closer to our Sphinx's tutelages and extra triggers. We then have Nyssa, Vital Force, so for 3 and 2 green, Planeswalker with 5 loyalty. Her +1 ability, untap target land you control. Until your next turn, it becomes a 5/5 elemental creature token with haste, and it is still a land. So if your opponent is showing no board state, or they've tapped out for example, we can go the combat damage route, make ourselves a 5/5 land, which is quite difficult to remove, short of a Lightning Axe or other hard-casted removal like Murder or Unlicensed Disintegration. Excuse me. So we may want to do that. If our opponent has got a Planeswalker on the battlefield, this might just straight up kill it as well. So she's really good at protecting herself with her 1/1. With her +1, sorry. Her -3 allows us to return target permanent from our graveyard to our hand. So if our opponent has destroyed our tutelages, or we're playing a mirror match and they've milled our tutelage cards, then we can -3 her right out the gate, go grab one of our Sphinx's tutelages and replay it to carry on the train. The main reason to play her though is for her ultimate, because it's quite brutal in a mill deck. So you get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So officially, every single land will mill our opponent for 2 cards, which won't take us very long. It really won't. So in a mirror match, having Nyssa ultimated and our land drops, milling our opponent is just as probably the best way to pull out of the game and get ahead of your opponent. Because in a mirror match, we are kind of slower than our opponent's mill deck. Because our opponent's mill deck is usually just card draw spells and ways to find tutelages and to discard and redraw, burn your opponent, that kind of thing. So it's completely focused on the tutelage. We're kind of focused on really slowly milling our opponent, so we're kind of built for the longer matchups, that kind of thing. So usually in a mirror match we probably would lose, but with Nyssa's ultimate, that's probably just not going to be the case, because you're milling for 2 every single time you draw a land, you're milling for 2 when you draw a card on the beginning of your upkeep, so every turn cycle you're likely milling for 4, which is essentially the equivalent of having 2 tutelages on the battlefield. So it's really good. We then have Torrential Gearhulk, so for 4 and 2 blue, a 5/6 with flash. When Torrential Gearhulk enters the battlefield, you may cast an instant spell from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that card will be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So this guy is great for getting in front of your opponent's creatures. We do run a low creature count, so our opponent might be very inclined to start attacking us with their best creatures, since we're not providing any kind of suitable blockers. And in which case we could flash out a 5/6. And if we choose to do so, we can Glimmer of Genius for free. We can come all the way to Hydra lash and stop our opponent from getting that extra little bit of damage. So we could, essentially, we can fog our opponent and still kill their creatures that way. So it's really kind of good for that. And we can just fog for 6 mana. So it's another fog in a nutshell. We then have Green Warden of Morasa. So for 4 and 2 green, a 5/4. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. And when it dies, you may do the exact same thing, except for you exile Green Warden from your graveyard. So this is 2 options to get a fog, essentially. Or even grab ourselves our Nyssa or our Gearhulk or our Vexing Scuttler back out of our graveyard. It grabs any card you want. So even if you need another land, for example, off of your Nyssa ultimate, Green Warden's going to be able to grab that for you. You can grab absolutely any card in our deck, so you can consider all of these an extra +1 after you've been used if we draw into Green Warden, which is really good. Reduces the variance just that little bit. It does cost a fair bit, so you'll be doing whatever you grabbed probably on the next turn, but still, it's really good. Decent blocker and great for slowing down your opponent. Finally, we have Vexing Scuttler. So for 8 mana, we have a 4/5. When you cast Vexing Scuttler, you may return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So we can grab our fogs, we can grab our card draw spells, we can grab a board wipes, which Vexing Scuttler will survive. She can also trigger Kozilek's Return in your graveyard to deal 5 damage to each creature before she lands. So you can use her as a board wipe as well. I'm assuming it's a she. I don't know why. But yeah, you can literally grab any instant or sorcery. So fogs, burn, you know, that kind of thing. And yeah. She also has a merge, so her merge cost is 6 and a blue, and what that essentially means is you get to cast this spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the cost minus the mana cost of the creature that you sacrificed. So if we want to, for example, sacrifice our Green Warden for the 6 mana, the emerge cost on Vexing Scuttler is 1, that kind of thing. Same for Torrential Gear Hulk. Once we've got the use out of them, we can sack them to Vexing Scuttler. We can either go further down and Thing in the Ice will reduce it by 2, that kind of thing. There's not many emerge options for Vexing Scuttler, but we usually slow our opponent down significantly that we can actually just straight up cast the Vexing Scuttler for the 8 mana anyway. So even if we don't have targets for the emerge, which is the optimal scenario, we can still get them out at 8 mana. We're still usually alive at that point. So that's essentially the deck. Onto the mana base, it's a little bit all over the place. So we have 3 islands, 3 mountains, 3 forests. Speaks for itself. We do have a fairly even curve right up the board. So we have our 1 mana greens, 2 mana blues, and then we get into 3 mana and we just have 3 mana of everything, of all colours. And then later down the line we have a lot of doubles as well. So it's very important that we have an even mana curve, because although we have 7 and 17 and 12, although there is this big difference, by turn 3 we kind of do want double red. So we want to make sure that our mana base is nice and even, that we have doubles of every single colour by turn 3, which is why all the mana is even. We then have Lumbering Falls. Lumbering Falls enters the battlefield tapped, and it is a Simic card, so for green and blue you get to add to your mana pool. What it's really here for, though, is for stopping your opponent from attacking and maybe getting in on your opponent's planeswalkers. So for 2, a green and a blue, Lumbering Falls becomes a 3/3 green and blue elemental creature with hexproof that is still a land. So we can actually turn it into a 3/3. It's not targetable by your opponent, so we can't burn it away. We could then block, and if we choose to do so after that, we could maybe fog as well with the green mana that Lumbering Falls still generates as a creature, because it is still a land. So it's really good for that. It's really hard to deal with for your opponent. If we've wiped our board, for example, we still have Lumbering Falls hanging around, so man lands are really good for that kind of thing. We then have Wandering Fumarole. So yet again, another man land, except for its Izzet colours, so for blue and red. However, for 2, a blue and a red, until the end of your turn, Wandering Fumarole becomes a 1/4 blue and red elemental creature token with the ability to switch its power and toughness whenever you want. So it can become a 1/4 or a 4/1. So if we're going for the damage route, we can go to 4/1. If our opponent tries to burn it, we just swap it back, essentially, and we attack for 1 damage. And usually survive most burn spells with a Wandering Fumarole, because most 4 damage burn spells are sorcery speed, unless they are lightning axes, which essentially we 2/1 our opponent that way, because they're kind of forced to discard, unless it's Fiery Tempers, and then they get the full value, but, you know, that kind of thing. So it's really good for that. We then have Cinderglade, so a mountain or a forest check land, so enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. So we do have plenty of ways of getting those in. We have 9 basics out of our 24 lands, so they quite often come into play tapped, but you know, we do later down the line have the option of making them come into play untapped. In the late game, the chances are that all of our lands will come into play untapped. But in the early game, that might not necessarily be the case, so we kind of have to be a bit picky about what lands we play right at the beginning of the game. We then have the equivalent in the Buddy lands, so for Rootbound Crag enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest, adds red or green. So that includes our basic lands, but it also includes our Cinderglade, which is a mountain or a forest. So if this guy came into play tapped last turn, this one will come into play untapped, so we'll have double red and double green on turn 2 with these 2 cards in play. We then have the equivalent in blue and green, comes into battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or an island. And then finally a Sulphur Falls comes into play tapped unless you control an island or a mountain. We then have Garrix Sanitarium, just a single. It is a legendary land though that adds colourless mana. Since we are 3 colours, it's a bit risky to run colourless lands, just because we really need our doubles really early on and still need our doubles later on. But its ability is really useful if you can get it going. So for 2, you get to tap, each player draws a card, then discard a card. So this is us finding our extra tutelage, maybe getting a tutelage trigger or 2. And if our opponent's on 0 cards, they're getting no benefit out of it. Yet again, if you are using this card, you want to be using this ability when it least suits your opponent. So if they're tapped out, for example, you can avoid them using the madness cost to cast their spells, that kind of thing. And finally, we have Ether Hubs. Ether Hub enters the battlefield, you gain 1 energy. It adds colours to your mana pool. However, if you pay an energy, you get to add 1 mana of any colour to your mana pool. So this really sorts out our mana in the early game and the late game. It generates the energy, so it has 1 use. However, we do have Glimmer of Genius to add 2 extra energy in order to reuse our Ether Hubs later down the line. That's the deck anyway, guys. So if you enjoyed the look of the deck, then be sure to watch the matches that should be following shortly after this video, if not already. If you really enjoyed if you really enjoyed the deck tech, then be sure to leave a like. It helps me out a great deal. Lets me know you're enjoying the content. Subscribe if you haven't already for more Magic Duels content, as well as other stuff. And if you're not sure what that is, then stay for the end card, see the rest of it, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.